You ever hear a title and immediately think, wait, what exactly happened there? Because who gave you permission to sit, human, is not a question that ends well for whoever asked it. Stay with me, because the answer to that question changes everything. Marcus Venn had a gift for being in the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment. Not catastrophically wrong. No shuttle crashes, no diplomatic incidents, no accidentally triggering wars between civilizations. Just the small, grinding kind of wrong. The kind where you round a corner and walk straight into a conversation you were never supposed to hear. The kind where you sit down at a table and only realize 3 seconds later that every set of eyes in the room has gone flat and still. He was a logistics coordinator attached to the Interstellar Commerce Delegation. Fancy title. What it actually meant was tracking cargo manifests, cross-referencing tariff codes, and making sure that when 40 tons of rare earth minerals left the Vakarath outer belt, they showed up somewhere instead of quietly vanishing into the black. Not glamorous. But Jason had always found something satisfying in the work. The clean logic of it, the way a correct manifest felt like a solved equation. It was predictable. And on a station that hosted 11 different species, 4 competing trade guilds, and 1 territorial dispute that had been under diplomatic review for 37 years, predictable was survival. He had learned that early. Humans who made themselves useful and unobtrusive went home at the end of their contracts with all their original limbs and a modest pension. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. The Vakarath Grand Conclave happened once every 6 years. Marcus knew this the way he knew the station's oxygen recycling schedule. Important background information, filed under not personally relevant. The conclave was where 11 recognized species gathered under the authority of the sovereign Empress of the Vakarath Dominion to renegotiate trade agreements, settle disputes, and perform whatever elaborate rituals kept interstellar civilization from eating itself alive. Humans had observer status, not delegate status, observer. The distinction, Marcus had been told on his first day, was extremely important, and he should never under any circumstances confuse the two. He had not confused them. He had gone to considerable effort to stay invisible during the conclave's opening week, rerouting his daily path to avoid the grand assembly corridors, eating lunch at different times to dodge the overflow of dignitaries clogging the upper levels. He was doing well. He was genuinely doing beautifully. Then the manifest error happened. Small error. A single container of Vakarath ceremonial grain, the kind used specifically in conclave ritual offerings, had been logged under the wrong clearance code and routed to secondary cold storage instead of the Empress's private preparation chamber. Marcus caught it at 340 during his nightly audit. He flagged it to his supervisor. No answer. Flagged it to the secondary contact. Also nothing. He checked the delivery window. The grain was needed by 600. He fixed it himself. This was, in retrospect, the decision that started everything. Getting the container rerouted was straightforward. Getting it physically delivered required him to accompany the cargo droid through 2 security checkpoints and down a corridor he had never walked before. Dark stone panels etched in sharp, angular Vakarath script, running the full length of the walls. He was focused on the manifest confirmation screen in his hand. He was not focused on the door at the far end, which was ajar, or on the fact that it was ajar because someone had recently passed through it, or on the fact that whoever had passed through it had not expected company at 520 in the morning. He walked in. The room was vast and dim. A ring of suspended light elements cast everything in deep amber. The floor was polished to a mirror finish. At the far end, elevated on a stepped platform, sat a single chair. Not a throne exactly, not the ceremonial kind from historical archives, but something that communicated the same absolute certainty about its occupant's status. The kind of chair that didn't need ornamentation because the room itself was the ornamentation. She was standing in front of it, back turned, robes not yet fully arranged. 2 attendants froze mid-motion. The cargo droid bumped gently against Marcus's heel and stopped. He did what any reasonable person would do. He looked for somewhere to set down the manifest screen, found nowhere, and stood there holding it like a complete idiot. The Empress of the Vakarath Dominion turned around. Marcus had read the official physical descriptions in the station briefing documents. The Vakarath were tall. She stood a full head and a half above him. Her features were sharply defined, almost architectural, with high, prominent brow ridges and eyes that caught and held light in a way that felt less biological and more geological, like polished dark stone. Her bearing wasn't aggressive. It was something considerably more unsettling than aggressive. It was certain. The kind of certainty that had never once, in its entire existence, needed to raise its voice. She looked at him, not through him, directly at him, taking inventory. Then she said something in Vakarath, low, precise, exactly 2 syllables. One of the attendants, a young woman whose expression suggested she was already mentally drafting her resignation, translated in a whisper. She asked what you were doing in her preparation chamber. Marcus held up the manifest screen. Delivering ceremonial grain. Clearance code error. I can leave immediately. The attendant translated. The Empress listened. 3 more words. She wants to know your name and function. Marcus Venn, logistics coordinator, human delegation, observer status. A pause. The Empress spoke longer this time. The attendant's expression shifted into something Marcus couldn't categorize. She says, the attendant began carefully, that you came to her chamber before dawn, alone, carrying her offerings without being summoned. She wants to know who gave you permission. Marcus considered several answers. He went with the truth. No one. I gave myself permission. The grain needed to be here by 600 and there was no one else available. The silence that followed had texture. The 2 attendants exchanged a look that Marcus would spend a considerable amount of time thinking about later. The Empress said nothing. Then, slowly, she turned back toward the platform and made a gesture so slight he almost missed it. Not dismissed, not arrested, indicated. He was still working out what that meant when one of the attendants appeared at his elbow and said very quietly, "You should sit down. She is going to ask you more questions." There was only one place to sit. Marcus looked at it. He looked at the attendant. The attendant gave him the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything. He sat down. In the chair. I still can't tell you whether that was the bravest thing he ever did, or simply the most spectacularly oblivious. Honestly, at this point in the story, I'm not sure there's a difference. Nobody had ever sat in that chair before. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, a documented historical fact that Marcus would only learn about approximately 30 seconds after he wished he had learned it earlier. The seat of receiving, as it was formally designated in Vakarath ceremonial tradition, had existed for 214 years. In that time it had been occupied by exactly one category of individual, the reigning Empress of the Vakarath dominion. Not visiting dignitaries, not allied sovereigns, not even the Empress's own family during informal gatherings. The chair existed for one person. That person was currently standing 8 feet away, watching a human logistics coordinator settle into it with the relaxed posture of someone who had been awake since 3 in the morning and had genuinely stopped caring about appearances. Marcus knew none of this. He knew the chair was large, that its armrests were positioned for someone with a considerably longer torso than his, and that the material beneath him was something that felt like woven stone, which should not have been comfortable but somehow was. He held his manifest screen in both hands and waited. The attendant who had told him to sit had retreated to the wall. Both attendants were now doing the thing where they were very carefully not looking at each other, which Marcus recognized as the universal body language of people who were going to have an extremely intense conversation the moment he left the room. The Empress hadn't moved. She was watching him with that same geological certainty. And Marcus, who had spent 6 years developing the skill of being unreadable in rooms full of alien dignitaries, looked back at her with the expression he privately called his manifest face, neutral, attentive, suggesting that whatever came next he was prepared to document it accurately. She spoke. The attendant translated without looking up from the floor. She asks if you understand what you are sitting in. A chair, Marcus said. I was told to sit. Translation. Response. The attendant's voice stayed carefully flat. She says that is technically accurate. I can stand if that's more appropriate. Translation. A pause that ran slightly too long. She says you may remain seated. Marcus remained seated. The Empress moved for the first time since he had entered, crossing the polished floor with a deliberateness that wasn't slow and wasn't fast, but occupied its own category of motion entirely. She stopped at the base of the platform steps, which put her almost level with him despite the height difference. Up close, The light-catching quality of her eyes was more pronounced. Not unsettling exactly, but the kind of detail that made everything else in the room harder to focus on. She asked something. The attendant translated. She wants to know if the grain manifest error was your mistake or someone else's. Someone else's. I caught it during the nightly audit. She asks why you didn't simply report it and leave it for the morning shift. Because the morning shift wouldn't have had enough time to fix it before the 600 deadline. He paused. I assumed the offering was time-sensitive. I didn't want to guess wrong about that. The translation happened. Something shifted in the Empress's expression. Not dramatically, not the way emotions moved across human faces, more like a very slight recalibration. The way a precision instrument adjusts when it encounters data that doesn't fit its previous model. She asked another question. The attendant hesitated before translating. She asks how you knew the grain was for a ritual offering and not standard provisions. The clearance code prefix, Marcus said. Ceremonial goods have a different prefix than consumables. I cross-reference them every cycle. He glanced at his manifest screen out of habit. Also, the container was temperature sealed to a range that doesn't make sense for anything you're just going to eat. Translation. A longer pause. The Empress said something that ran more than one sentence, and the attendant translated with slightly more care than before. She says you pay attention to details that most people in your position would consider beneath their notice. Marcus thought about it. That's the job. If I stop noticing small things, I miss when something important is wrong. He hadn't said it to impress anyone. It was just the most accurate description of how logistics coordination worked. But the Empress tilted her head, just slightly, just enough, and said something quiet to the nearer attendant that wasn't translated. The attendant nodded once and slipped out of the room. Marcus watched this and decided not to ask about it. He was already several layers outside his normal operational parameters. Adding questions felt unwise. The Empress came down the last 2 steps and stood on the main floor, even taller at ground level than she had seemed from above, and Marcus had a brief moment of appreciating, in a purely abstract way, why the Vekarath had built their diplomatic architecture the way they did. Everything about the physical environment was calibrated to make you aware of scale. She spoke again, and this time the remaining attendant's translation came with a tremor she was clearly working to suppress. She says that in 214 years, no one has sat in the seat of receiving except the Empress herself. Marcus processed this. He looked at the chair. He looked at the Empress. I see, he said. She says, the attendant continued, that Vekarath law has very specific provisions for what happens when someone occupies the seat of receiving. Marcus set his manifest screen carefully on his knee. What provisions? The attendant translated the question. The Empress responded. The attendant closed her eyes for exactly 1 second before translating. Under Vekarath ceremonial law, the seat of receiving establishes symbolic authority of presence. Whoever occupies it in the Empress's chamber, in the Empress's presence, before the opening of the conclave, is considered to have been received, formally received, as a recognized party. Recognized as what? Translation. Response. The attendant's voice had achieved a remarkable flatness, like someone reading weather forecasts during a natural disaster. The law does not specify a category. It specifies a status. The person received is considered to hold standing in the Empress's court for the duration of the conclave period. Marcus thought about observer status. He thought about the very clear distinction between observer status and delegate status that had been explained to him during his first week. He thought about the fact that he was a logistics coordinator who had walked into the wrong room at 5 in the morning carrying grain. That seems like an oversight in the law, he said. The attendant translated this. The Empress looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something, and for the first time since he had entered the room, the attendant's professional composure cracked, just at the edges, just enough to reveal something that looked remarkably like suppressed disbelief. She says, the attendant managed, that the law was written 214 years ago. No one anticipated the situation would require more specificity. Because no one else ever sat in the chair. Because no one else ever sat in the chair. Marcus nodded slowly. He picked up his manifest screen. He checked the time. 541. The grain still needs to be delivered to the preparation area, he said. The Empress watched him stand up from the seat of receiving, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had a delivery deadline. She said one more thing, short, precise. The attendant translated it barely above a whisper. She says you are either the most fearless person she has encountered in 20 years of ruling, or the most oblivious. Marcus moved toward the cargo droid. Honestly, he said, not looking back, I'm not sure there's much difference at this hour. And that right there, that one sentence, is where the story actually starts. Because the Empress laughed. Not visibly, not in any way a camera would catch. But she laughed. And in the Vakarath Dominion, that means something that Marcus Venn would spend the next 6 days learning to navigate. The news that a human logistics coordinator had been formally received into the Empress's court spread through the station the way all truly destabilizing information spreads, quietly, fast, and with the specific energy of people who can't decide whether to be outraged or fascinated, and keep cycling between both every 30 seconds. By the time Marcus had completed his delivery, filed his manifest confirmation, and returned to his small office near the lower decks, 3 messages were waiting on his terminal. One from his direct supervisor, asking him to come upstairs at his earliest convenience, in the tone that meant immediately. One from the human delegation's senior attaché, asking the same thing in considerably more alarmed language. The third was from an address he didn't recognize, written in Vakarath script that his terminal's translation function rendered as, "Report to court preparation, level 7, 900. Dress accordingly." Marcus stared at the third message for a long time. Then he looked down at his logistics coordinator uniform, practical, dark, bearing the small human delegation patch on the left shoulder, and thought about what dress accordingly meant when the instruction came from a court that had specific laws about chairs. He went to his supervisor first because he was, at his core, someone who dealt with things in the correct order. His supervisor's name was Director Callum Osei. 20 years in interstellar commerce administration had given the man a specific ability to stay calm in escalating situations. He was exercising that ability now with visible effort, seated behind his desk with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something trying very hard to be neutral. "Sit down, Marcus." Marcus sat. "I filed the manifest correction. The grain was delivered on time. The error originated in the overnight coding batch. I flagged the specific input field that generated the wrong prefix. It can be patched before the next cycle." "I don't care about the grain," Callum said. "I assumed you might want that on record anyway." "Marcus." Callum unfolded his hands and refolded them. "You were formally received into the Vakarath Empress's court this morning." "I was sitting in a chair." "You were sitting in the chair. There is apparently a significant legal distinction." "I've been informed." Marcus paused. "I didn't know about the law when I sat down. I was told to sit by one of the attendants." Callum's expression shifted. "You were told to sit by an imperial attendant?" "Yes. In the seat of receiving." "I didn't know it was called that at the time. It was just the only seat in the room." Marcus considered this. In retrospect, the room should have been a clue. Callum was quiet for a moment. "The senior attaché is concerned this creates a diplomatic complication. Humans have observer status at the conclave. If you've been granted court standing by the Empress herself, even accidentally, even through a legal technicality, that changes the formal hierarchy of the human delegation's position." "Does it?" It was a genuine question. Callum's expression said he knew that. "That's what we're trying to determine." He looked at Marcus carefully. "The Vakarath court liaison has already been in contact with the attaché's office this morning. They are not requesting that the reception be annulled." Marcus processed this. "That's an interesting choice." "It is an extremely interesting choice." Callum leaned back slightly. "The Empress could have framed this as an error. She could have had the law's application disputed. She chose not to, which means either she finds this situation legally convenient for reasons we don't yet understand, or she finds it personally convenient, or both." He paused. "Did anything happen in that room that I should know about?" Marcus thought about the grain delivery. He thought about the chair. He thought about the Empress asking careful, precise questions about manifest codes and clearance prefixes, and about the way her expression had shifted when he explained that he wasn't willing to guess wrong about a time-sensitive delivery. He thought about the very quiet sound at the end, the one the attendant's translation had almost buried, that he had filed away to think about later. "We had a conversation," Marcus said. "She asked me questions about my work. I answered them." "That's all?" "She seemed interested in why I noticed the coding error. I explained the audit process." He considered. "She may have found it unusual that I came personally to fix it instead of escalating." Callum looked at him with the expression of a man beginning to understand something he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. "Marcus, in Vicarath court culture, personal initiative on behalf of the Empress's household, unsolicited, uncompensated, executed with competence before dawn, carries significant ceremonial weight. I wasn't doing it for the Empress's household. I was doing it because the manifest was wrong. I understand that. The Vicarath court may not have received that specific memo." Callum picked up a document from his desk and set it down again without reading it. "You have a message from level 7. "Yes." "Are you going to go?" Marcus thought about observer status. He thought about the attendant's carefully neutral voice, reading him a 200-year-old law at 5 in the morning. He thought about 6 years of making himself useful and invisible, and the single morning he had stepped outside his routine and generated more direct contact with actual power than his entire career combined. There was something almost logistically satisfying about that, the way unexpected data sometimes revealed a pattern you hadn't known to look for. "The message said to dress accordingly," he said. "I'm not sure what I own qualifies." Callum reached into his desk drawer and produced a small, sealed package bearing the level 7 administrative seal. The court liaison sent this with the message. Apparently they anticipated the wardrobe problem. Marcus took the package, lighter than he expected. Inside, a single folded garment, deep charcoal, precise cut, with structural detail that suggested it had been measured for him specifically, which was impossible, since no one on level 7 had ever seen him, which meant someone had pulled his physical measurements from the station's administrative records, which had happened fast enough to accompany a message sent less than 3 hours ago. He held it up. Callum watched him. "Someone in that court works very quickly," Marcus said. "Yes," said Callum, "they do." Level 7 was nothing like the lower decks. Not a surprise, but the degree of difference still landed physically. The air quality was different. The acoustics were different. The light had been designed by someone with actual opinions about light, rather than someone who simply needed a room to not be dark. Marcus arrived at 858, wearing the court garment which fit precisely, and carrying his manifest screen out of habit before thinking better of it and leaving it in his pocket. The court preparation room was staffed by 4 attendants, none of whom were the 2 from the morning. They processed his arrival with an efficiency suggesting they had been thoroughly briefed on exactly who he was, and had feelings about that briefing they were professionally suppressing. The senior attendant, the kind of posture that came from years of standing in important rooms, approached him and spoke in clear, translated standard. "You will be presented at the pre-conclave court assembly at the 11th hour. You will stand at the 3rd position of the receiving line." She paused. "Do you know what the 3rd position means?" "No," Marcus said. She looked at him for a moment. "It means you are not a guest, not an observer, and not a supplicant. It means you are known to the Empress." Another pause, more deliberate. "In 20 years of her reign, she has placed 3 individuals in the 3rd position. All 3 were subsequently appointed to permanent advisory roles in the Dominion." Marcus absorbed this with the same expression he used when a manifest number didn't match its expected value. Careful, attentive, not yet drawing conclusions but storing the data with considerable precision. "I delivered grain this morning," he said. The senior attendant looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the same one the first attendant had used, the same one Callum had used, the expression of people who kept running into the gap between what Marcus said and what the situation actually meant, and kept finding that gap, against all reasonable expectation, oddly compelling. "Yes," she said, "you did." Here's what I keep coming back to. Every single person in that station understood the weight of what was happening, except the one person it was happening to. And somehow that's exactly why it was happening to him. The court assembly hall on level 7 was designed to make everyone inside it acutely aware of their own smallness, not accidental. Marcus had read enough about Vicarath architecture during his 6 years on the station to know their public spaces were engineered with the same precision they applied to everything else. Ceiling height calculated to produce a specific acoustic resonance, column spacing arranged to create sightlines that drew every eye toward a single focal point, the floor's reflective surface chosen not for aesthetics, but because it doubled the perceived height of anyone standing in it, which meant it also doubled the perceived authority of whoever occupied the room's elevated center. He stood in the third position of the receiving line and thought about sightlines. 41 dignitaries were present, representing 9 of the 11 recognized species of the outer belt. The other 2 sent delegates who stood in the observer gallery above, a long elevated walkway running along 3 walls, glassed on the front, so its occupants could see everything and be seen seeing it without being part of it. Marcus knew the observer gallery well. He had stood in it during the previous conclave 6 years ago, watching proceedings with the detached professional interest of a man who needed to understand the political environment well enough to anticipate its effect on cargo routing. He was not in the gallery now. The 2 individuals flanking him in the receiving line were a Vakarath court minister, her ceremonial rank indicated by a specific collar configuration Marcus had looked up that morning, and a Dominion trade architect whose credentials had been included in the briefing document the senior attendant had handed him before the assembly. Both Vakarath, both considerably taller than Marcus. Both had been informed of his presence in the third position, with enough advance notice to arrange their expressions into something professionally unreadable, which Marcus suspected had taken real effort. The minister had spoken to him once, briefly, before the assembly doors opened. "You are the human from this morning," she had said, not a question. "Marcus Venn," he confirmed. "Logistics." She had looked at him with the particular attention of someone trying to categorize a thing they had no existing category for. "You know what this position means?" "I was informed." "And you are not alarmed?" Marcus had considered the question seriously, which seemed to catch her off guard. "I'm in a situation I didn't create and can't currently change," he said. "Being alarmed wouldn't improve it. I'd rather pay attention." She had said nothing after that, but she had looked at him differently, with that fractional recalibration he was beginning to recognize as the Vakarath equivalent of a reassessment, almost imperceptible. Marcus had spent 6 years tracking small discrepancies in large datasets, and he noticed it the same way he noticed a misaligned decimal point. The assembly began precisely on time. The Empress entered from the northern passage, and the room's response didn't require cultural context to understand. It was the response of a space full of people simultaneously reminded of exactly where they stood, relative to the person who had just walked in. Marcus felt it too, the instinctive recalibration of scale, and filed it as useful data about how physical presence could function as communication that preceded language entirely. She moved through the formal reception sequence with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed it hundreds of times, without letting repetition produce carelessness. Each interaction precise, each acknowledgement calibrated. Marcus watched her work the room with the same analytical attention he gave to complex routing systems, tracing the logic, identifying the patterns, noting where the pattern shifted. She reached the receiving line. The minister to his left received a formal address and a specific hand gesture the briefing document identified as recognition of continued service. The trade architect to his right received a shorter address and a different gesture, appointment acknowledgement, standard for both. Then the Empress reached Marcus. She stopped. The room, which had maintained a low ambient sound of shuffling and breath and occasional whispered translations, went quiet. Not the performed quiet of people making a point of being silent, the specific quiet of people who had been half paying attention and were now fully paying attention because something outside the expected sequence was happening. The Empress looked at him for a moment, then she spoke, and the court translator rendered it in standard, with the careful neutrality of someone who understood their job in this moment was to be invisible. "You returned," she said. "I was summoned," Marcus replied. "There is a difference between obeying a summons and choosing to honor it." A pause. "You could have claimed confusion. You could have cited your observer status as a barrier to attendance. Several people in your delegation suggested that option to your supervisors this morning." Marcus absorbed the fact that she was aware of his meeting with Callum without showing any visible reaction to it. "Those would have been legitimate positions," he said. "They weren't accurate to the situation." "Explain the distinction." "Claiming confusion would have required me to pretend I didn't understand what happened this morning. I understood it." Citing observer status would have required me to pretend the reception didn't occur. It occurred. He kept his voice level. I don't find it useful to pretend things didn't happen. The translator rendered this. The room stayed quiet. The Empress tilted her head, the same fractional movement from the preparation chamber, precise and deliberate. Most individuals in your position would find it extremely useful to pretend things didn't happen. Most individuals in my position aren't logistics coordinators, Marcus said. My entire function is accurate documentation of what actually occurred, regardless of whether it's convenient. I'm professionally opposed to pretending. Something moved through the room at that. Not quite sound, more like a shift in atmospheric pressure. The collective adjustment of 41 dignitaries recalibrating to a register they hadn't expected. The minister to Marcus's left was doing the thing where she was very carefully not reacting, which he had come to understand was itself a significant reaction. The Empress studied him a moment longer. Then she said something to the court minister in Vikarath, brief, 3 words, and the minister responded with a single word the translator didn't render into standard. The Empress turned to continue down the receiving line, and the assembly's ambient sound gradually resumed. Marcus stood in the 3rd position and breathed. The minister leaned toward him by a fraction. She told me to ensure you are seated at the secondary council table for the afternoon session, she said quietly. Not the observer level, the secondary council table. Marcus processed this. The secondary council table was, per the station briefing documents, reserved for recognized advisory parties with active roles in conclave proceedings. Formally 4 steps below the primary council, informally about 400 steps above where he had been standing yesterday morning, with a cargo droid and a manifest screen. What does that involve? He asked. Listening, the minister said. For today, only listening. But she will know if you are paying attention. I pay attention to everything, Marcus said. The minister made a sound that wasn't quite a response and wasn't quite an acknowledgement, and somewhere in its register contained the very faint edge of something that might have been amusement, if Vikarath court culture had a recognized category for amusement at formal assemblies, which Marcus was fairly certain it did not. The afternoon session ran 3 hours. Marcus sat at the secondary council table and listened with the complete attention of someone who understood that everything he was currently receiving was either directly useful or context for something that would become useful later. Trade route renegotiations, territorial boundary clarifications, resource allocation disputes that had been running 11 years and showed every sign of running 11 more. The procedural language was dense and the references were deep, but Marcus had spent 6 years adjacent to exactly these conversations through their downstream effects on cargo manifests, and the architecture of the disputes was familiar, even where the specific details were new. He didn't speak, didn't signal, kept a mental ledger of names, positions, and the specific points where each speaker's language shifted from procedural to personally invested, because that shift was always where the real information lived. At the session's close, as dignitaries filed toward the reception corridor, the court minister appeared at his elbow. She will want a report, the minister said. Marcus looked at her. On what? On what you observed. The minister's expression stayed carefully neutral. She watches how people listen. You listened differently than anyone else at that table. I listened like a logistics coordinator, Marcus said. Yes, said the minister. And then, with the precise deliberateness of someone who had chosen their words with full awareness of their weight, that is apparently what she wanted. I've sat with this part of the story longer than any other, because this is the moment where Marcus stops being someone things are happening to and starts being someone who is happening to things. He doesn't know that yet, but she does. The report the Empress wanted was not a formal document. Marcus had assumed it would be, had mentally drafted a structured summary during the walk from the assembly hall, organizing his observations into the same clean categories he used for logistics audits: parties, positions, points of friction, downstream implications. He had been ready to deliver it in writing, or through the court translator, or through the minister as intermediary. All procedures he understood, all navigable. Instead, at the 7th hour of the evening, a single attendant arrived at the small anteroom he had been assigned near Level 7's administrative corridor and told him the Empress would receive him in the reading chamber. Not the preparation room from the morning, somewhere different. The attendant offered no additional context, and Marcus, who had learned that asking questions whose answers would arrive shortly regardless was an inefficient use of everyone's time, didn't ask for any. The reading chamber was smaller than every other room he had seen on level 7. This landed immediately because Vakarath architecture ran on the principle that importance expressed itself through scale. A smaller room meant either lesser significance or the specific kind of significance that had nothing to prove. The ceiling was lower, the light warmer. Actual books lined the walls, physical volumes in angular Vakarath script, arranged with the order of things that were genuinely read rather than displayed. A low table sat at the center of the room with 2 seats positioned across from each other, neither elevated above the other. Marcus stood in the doorway doing what he always did in unfamiliar spaces, and the Empress looked up from the document she was reading and said something to the translator stationed near the wall. "She says you are doing it again," the translator rendered. Marcus stepped inside. "Doing what?" "Mapping the room before you enter it." He considered denying this, decided against it on the grounds that it was accurate. "Old habit. I work with physical spaces a lot. I like to know where things are." The Empress set down her document. She had changed from the assembly robes into something considerably less architectural, still precise, still structured, but without the ceremonial weight that had made her earlier appearance feel like encountering a geographical feature rather than a person. She gestured toward the seat across from her, with the same economy of motion he had noticed in everything she did. No wasted movement. He was starting to think of it as a characteristic rather than a performance. He sat down. This time he knew what he was sitting in before he sat in it, and it was simply a chair, and he sat in it without ceremony because there was no ceremony attached to it. He suspected that too was a deliberate choice on her part. "Tell me what you observed this afternoon," she said through the translator. Marcus organized his thoughts. The boundary dispute in the Kelavar corridor has been running 11 years because both parties are using it to avoid a separate resource negotiation that neither wants to initiate. The boundary isn't the actual problem. It's a position each side can hold without conceding anything, which makes it more valuable to them unresolved than resolved. The translator rendered this. The Empress was quiet. "Continue." The Outer Belt Transit Tax renegotiation has 3 formal parties and 1 informal. The Drivathi delegation's language shifted register every time the Sulari senior delegate spoke, not the content, the register. They're coordinating something outside the formal session. Whatever they agree to in the chamber is going to look different from whatever they've already agreed to in private. Another pause. What else? The human delegation's observer status creates a specific blind spot in the Council's modeling of trade flow impact. 3 proposals discussed this afternoon have direct downstream effects on human-operated logistics corridors that none of the primary delegates flagged. Either they don't know, or they find it convenient not to address it. I don't know which yet. The Empress looked at him steadily. She spoke at more length than before, and the translator took a moment to render it carefully. In 3 hours of a formal conclave session, 4 senior delegates with decades of council experience identified 2 of those 3 observations between them. You identified all 3, and an additional layer of the second one that none of them reached. Marcus processed this. I was looking at different things than they were. Explain. Senior delegates are watching the formal proceedings. They're tracking what's being said against what was said in previous sessions, looking for deviation from established positions. That's the correct approach for their role. He paused, organizing it precisely. I was watching the proceedings the way I watch a cargo routing system. I'm not comparing to historical positions. I'm looking at where the flow is moving and where it's being blocked, and asking what the blockage is protecting. The translator rendered this. The Empress stayed quiet longer than before. The room's small sounds became more present. Ventilation, the faint hum of the station, the particular quality of silence that exists when someone is thinking rather than simply waiting. Then she said something the translator rendered with careful evenness. She asks how long you have been applying logistics methodology to political systems. Marcus thought about it honestly. I don't know that I have been specifically. I think it's the same underlying approach. Identifying where things are supposed to go, identifying where they're actually going, and figuring out what's creating the gap. He considered. Politics and cargo routing have the same basic problem. Everyone has a destination they'll tell you about, and a destination they're actually moving toward. My job is to track the actual movement. The Empress spoke again. The translator's voice stayed even. She says that is the most accurate description of statecraft she has heard expressed in fewer than 30 words. Marcus wasn't sure how to respond to this, so he said nothing, which turned out to be correct because she continued without waiting for one. What followed was genuinely difficult to categorize. Not a debrief, not a formal session. Something Marcus kept trying to file under a label and kept failing to, which was notable because he filed things accurately and quickly as a rule. She asked questions, precise, well-constructed questions that built on each other like the architecture of someone who had been thinking about this specific territory for considerably longer than the conversation had been running. She asked about the Dravathi-Sulari coordination and what he thought its purpose was. She asked about the Kelevar boundary dispute and what a resolution framework would need to offer each side to make agreement more valuable than continued stalemate. She asked about the human delegation's blind spot and whether it was structural or intentional. Marcus answered each question the same way he answered manifest discrepancies, clearly, directly, without softening assessments that were uncomfortable, and without overstating confidence in assessments that were incomplete. Twice he said he didn't know. Once he said he had a hypothesis but not enough data to support it, and offered the hypothesis anyway with that caveat attached. Each time he did this, the Empress's responses shifted slightly, registering the intellectual honesty as data rather than weakness. At some point, the translator had quietly stopped rendering every sentence and moved to a shorter relay. Her questions in full, his responses compressed into a faster exchange that kept the conversation's momentum. Marcus noticed this and understood it to mean either the translator's stamina was flagging, or the Empress was following his standard well enough that full translation had become partial redundancy. He filed the observation away. "There is a proposal being introduced in tomorrow's third session," she said, through the translator, with a deliberateness that signaled a shift in the conversation's purpose. It concerns restructuring transit authority in 4 corridors currently administered jointly by the Dominion and the Sulari Compact. The proposal comes from the Sulari delegation. I know its surface structure. I do not yet fully understand what the Sulari expect to gain from the specific framing they have chosen. Marcus looked at her. "You want me to look at the framing? I want to know what a logistics coordinator who reads political movement as cargo flow sees when he reads it. I'll need the document." She spoke to the attendant near the door. A moment later, the document was in front of Marcus, physical, printed on Vekarath formal paper, the angular script running in columns. The translator moved closer. Marcus read it once straight through without stopping, then went back to the beginning and read it again more slowly, tracking the specific points where the language shifted from technical to administrative, and from administrative to something else he needed another moment to name properly. He found it in the third section, small, the kind of small that was either a genuine oversight or the entire point. And given that the Sulari senior delegate had shifted register every time his Dravathi counterpart spoke, Marcus did not think it was an oversight. "The transit authority restructuring is legitimate on its face," he said, "but the third section redefines the reporting threshold for autonomous cargo decisions in those corridors. The new threshold is high enough that a significant category of shipment, roughly the medium volume tier, falls below the line for joint oversight. They're not trying to take the corridors, they're trying to create a volume range inside the corridors where they can move things without triggering the joint review process." The translator rendered this. The Empress went very still. "That volume range," Marcus continued, "corresponds almost exactly to the capacity profile of the Dravathi standard carrier configuration." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then the Empress said something short and precise, and the translator rendered it with the care of someone fully aware of what they were conveying. She says that 4 of her senior analysts reviewed this document this morning. None of them found that. "They were probably reading it as a political document," Marcus said. "I read it as a shipping manifest. The discrepancy is in the numbers, not the language. Political readers look at the language." She looked at him across the low table. The reading chamber was very quiet. Outside, the station ran its ordinary operations. Cargo moved, manifests were filed. The enormous grinding machinery of interstellar commerce continued without pause. Marcus sat in a small, warm room on level 7 and understood with the precise clarity he brought to all data that finally resolved into a coherent pattern that his life had taken a turn that wasn't going to turn back. "Tomorrow's session," the Empress said, You will sit at the primary council table. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, organized what he wanted to say. I have observer status. You had observer status, she said. The seat of receiving was not a technicality, Marcus Venn. I was there. I made a choice, and there it is. The thing she had been waiting for him to understand since 5 in the morning. She didn't receive him because of a 200-year-old law. She received him because in 20 years of ruling, nobody had ever walked into her chamber before dawn, carrying her offerings and answered her questions like the answers actually mattered. The primary council table was a single piece of Vakarath black stone, 40 feet long, polished to the same mirror finish as the assembly hall floor, seating 22 in a configuration that communicated hierarchy through proximity to the center, rather than through elevation. Marcus knew this from the briefing documents. What the briefing documents hadn't conveyed was the specific quality of attention that 21 senior delegates from 9 species produced when directed at a single point, which was currently him, as he took the seat the court minister indicated with a gesture that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and an act of considerable political courage on her part. He sat down, placed his hands flat on the table surface, looked straight ahead. The Sulari senior delegate was seated 7 positions to his left. Marcus didn't look at him directly, but tracked him in peripheral vision with the same background attention he gave to any variable with the potential to affect the day's outcomes. His name, per the briefing materials updated overnight by the minister's office and delivered to Marcus's anteroom at 06:30, was Senior Envoy Karath. 18 years as the Sulari Compact's lead negotiator at every conclave, experienced, precise, and, according to 3 separate assessments in the briefing materials, exceptionally skilled at reading rooms. He was reading this one now. Marcus could feel it without looking. The Drevathi delegation sat across the table. The senior delegate had been the one whose register shifts Marcus had noted during the previous afternoon's session. She was watching the Empress's seat at the table's head with the focused stillness of someone waiting for a signal. Marcus noted the angle of her attention and filed it. The session opened with procedural formalities that Marcus followed carefully, tracking the specific language used in each formal acknowledgement. The briefing materials had flagged that procedural language in Vakarath conclave sessions carried coded meaning that experienced delegates read alongside the surface content. He had spent an hour that morning with the court translator, working through the key formulations and their embedded implications. The translator had looked at him during that session with an expression suggesting this was not typically how new council members spent their preparation time. The first hour covered 2 boundary clarifications and a resource allocation adjustment that resolved more cleanly than Marcus had expected, based on the previous afternoon's temperature. He watched the resolution happen and traced it backward, found a small procedural concession the court minister had introduced in the opening formalities that had reframed the allocation question in a way that gave both parties a face-saving path to agreement. Elegant, nearly invisible. Marcus appreciated the craftsmanship, the way he appreciated a clean manifest reconciliation. The Transit Authority proposal came up in the second hour. Senior Envoy Karath presented it with the smooth confidence of 18 years at the primary table, moving through the surface structure efficiently, addressing anticipated objections before they could be raised, framing the corridor restructuring as a modernization of outdated joint oversight protocols that no longer reflected operational realities. His language was precise, his pace was measured. He was very good at his work, and Marcus watched him with complete attention, tracking the gap between the document's 3rd section and the presentation's deliberate avoidance of it. The Empress hadn't looked at Marcus since the session began. She occupied the table's head with the same geological certainty he had observed in every room he'd seen her in, conducting the session through the formal mechanisms of the court minister and the translator relay. Her attention to all visible appearances was distributed evenly across the table. Marcus had stopped assuming her attention was doing what it appeared to be doing. 3 delegates asked questions following Karath's presentation. All 3 addressed the surface structure. All 3 received competent answers that confirmed the proposal's surface legitimacy and moved the conversation toward preliminary endorsement. Marcus watched the room's momentum building toward a procedural vote that would send the proposal to the formal drafting stage, which would make its 3rd section provisions considerably harder to address without the political cost of reopening a document that had already received preliminary council approval. The court minister's gaze moved to Marcus for exactly 1 second. Marcus had been thinking about this moment since 06:30 that morning, sitting in the anteroom with the briefing documents and a cold cup of whatever level 7 catering considered appropriate for a logistics coordinator who was unexpectedly attending his first primary council session. He had thought about observer status and the specific distance between where he had been and where he was sitting now. He had thought about the Empress saying, "You had observer status," with the precision of someone who understood the difference between past and present tense. He had thought about 6 years of making himself useful and unobtrusive, and about the specific morning he had stopped being unobtrusive by accident and discovered that the accident had been noticed by someone who didn't appear to experience accidents as accidental. He had also thought, with the practical clarity that was his dominant mode, about what happened to cargo that moved through an oversight gap. He had seen it many times. Small volumes below the review threshold, accumulating over months and years into patterns that only became visible in retrospect, long after the original routing decision had been forgotten. The damage was never in the single shipment. The damage was in the infrastructure of invisibility that the gap created. He raised his hand. A human gesture, and therefore not the correct Vekarath procedural signal for requesting the floor. He used the correct signal instead, a specific forearm angle on the table surface that the briefing described as a recognized request for contribution from a recognized advisory party. The room noticed. Not loudly. The way rooms notice things when the thing being noticed fell outside the expected sequence of events. The Empress acknowledged him through the court minister's formal relay. Marcus spoke clearly and without preamble. The third section of the proposal redefines the reporting threshold for autonomous cargo decisions in the 4 affected corridors. The new threshold establishes a volume range between 40 and 80 standard units that falls below the joint oversight trigger. I want to understand the operational basis for that specific range. The translator rendered this. The table went quiet. Karath responded after a brief pause, smooth, unhurried, the response of someone who had prepared for objections and was now locating Marcus's question within his prepared framework. The range reflected current average transaction volumes in the corridors, he explained. The intent was to reduce administrative burden on low-impact movements that consumed joint oversight resources disproportionate to their significance. The Drivathi standard carrier configuration operates at 63 standard units loaded capacity, Marcus said. That's inside the new threshold range. The table went still in a way that was different from its previous stillness. Karath looked at him for the first time since the session began. Direct. The specific attention of someone recalibrating a situation they had been confident they had correctly mapped. The proposal addresses corridor administration generally, he said carefully. It is not carrier-specific. The effect is carrier-specific, Marcus said. A threshold defined in volume terms produces carrier-specific outcomes when carrier configurations cluster at specific volume profiles. The 40 to 80 range doesn't include the dominant carrier configurations of 7 of the 9 represented species. It includes 1. He paused. I'm not suggesting the intent is what the effect would be. I'm asking for the operational basis for that specific range, so the Council can assess whether the effect is an oversight or a feature. He had chosen the word oversight with full awareness of its double meaning in standard. The translator rendered it into Vekarath, and Marcus watched Karath's expression register the precision of the framing. The Drivathi senior delegate had stopped watching the Empress's position and was now watching Karath. The minister to Marcus's left was doing the thing where she was carefully not reacting. The Empress's hands were still on the table surface. Karath was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough to be meaningful at a table where experienced diplomats managed their silences with the same precision they managed their speech. The range reflects a working group analysis conducted over the previous cycle, he said. The documentation can be provided for council review before the formal drafting stage. That would be useful, Marcus said. And then, because the gap between what he had just done and what he was supposed to be was very present in the room, and he saw no value in pretending otherwise. I apologize if the format of the question was irregular. I'm still learning the procedural conventions. Accurate. Also, he understood, as he said it, the most disarming true thing he could have offered in that moment. Impossible to address as aggression when the person delivering it had openly acknowledged their own inexperience in the same breath as the most precise technical challenge the proposal had received. Several things happened in the following minutes. The preliminary vote was deferred pending documentation review. The Dravathi senior delegate requested a recess, during which she had a brief conversation with her junior delegate that Marcus observed from across the room without being able to hear it, noting that both delegates' postures shifted from the forward lean of people moving toward a goal to the more contained positioning of people reassessing their route. Karath spoke quietly to two other delegates, same postural shift. Marcus tracked it without making it obvious he was tracking it. The court minister appeared at his elbow during the recess. "You could have raised this last night," she said quietly. "She had the document. You could have given her the analysis then and let it be addressed through the Dominion's formal channels." "Yes," Marcus said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly. Because if the analysis came through the Dominion's channels, Karath would know where it originated and could prepare a counterframing before the session. At the table, in the session, with the full council present, he had to respond to the actual question instead of a prepared version of it. He paused. The documentation review will show whether the range was an oversight or intentional. If it was intentional, he now knows it was identified, and the proposal will be amended before drafting. If it was a genuine oversight, the amendment costs him nothing except a small delay. The minister was quiet for a moment. And if it was intentional but he amends it anyway? Then the corridor restructuring goes forward without the oversight gap, which was probably reasonable to begin with. Marcus looked at her directly. "I wasn't trying to kill the proposal. I was trying to close the gap. Those are different objectives." She looked at him with the expression he had seen several times now. The recalibration, the fractional shift of someone updating a model that had just encountered data it hadn't accounted for. "You are very unusual," she said. "I'm a logistics coordinator," Marcus said. "We're all a little unusual." The session resumed. By the fourth hour, 3 proposals had been resolved, 1 deferred, and the Transit Authority documentation formally requested with a review timeline attached. Marcus sat at the primary council table and contributed twice more, once on a resource allocation question, where his read of downstream cargo flow implications identified a compounding effect none of the other delegates had raised, and once to ask a clarifying question that was technically simple and structurally devastating to a piece of motivated ambiguity in a boundary proposal that had been moving toward ratification. By the session's close, he was aware that the room's attention had shifted. Not dramatically, not in the performed way that political attention sometimes shifted when someone wanted to signal their notice, in the quiet structural way that cargo routes shifted when a new node proved reliably efficient, gradually, incrementally, until the new route was simply the route. He walked out of the assembly hall beside the court minister, and she said almost to herself, 18 years Karath has sat at that table. "He's very good," Marcus said honestly. "Yes," she said, "he is." A pause. "You are something else." 6 years. 6 years of manifests and coding errors, and making himself invisible in the margins of other people's important work. And it turned out the whole time he had been building exactly the thing that a 200-year-old empire didn't know it needed. On the 5th day of the conclave, Senior Envoy Karath requested a private meeting with Marcus Venn. No briefing document had anticipated this. No attendant appeared at the anteroom door with advance notice. The request arrived through a junior Sulari aide who found Marcus in the Level 7 administrative corridor at 0730 and delivered it with the careful neutrality of someone instructed to convey the message without conveying any opinion about it. The meeting was proposed for the noon recess, a small conference room on Level 6, neutral ground, which itself communicated something. Karath wasn't inviting him to Sulari delegation territory and wasn't suggesting the Dominion's spaces. He was proposing the institutional middle, the bureaucratic equivalent of setting your weapons on the table before sitting down. Marcus accepted. He told the court minister. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "Do you want someone present?" "No," Marcus said. "Do you want preparation materials?" "I know what he wants to talk about." She studied him. "And what is that?" "He wants to know who I am," Marcus said. "Not my name or my function. He wants to understand what category I belong to so he knows how to model me going forward." He considered. He's been at this table for 18 years. He ran into something this week he didn't have a category for. That bothers him professionally. He wants to fix it. The minister was quiet for a moment. "And what will you tell him?" The truth, Marcus said. It's the most efficient option. Kareth was already in the conference room when Marcus arrived. Seated on the far side of the table, not at the head, not centered, slightly off to one side in a way that suggested he had thought carefully about where to sit and chosen a position that was neither dominant nor concessive. He was taller than Marcus had fully registered at the primary council table, with the angular precision of Sulari features that Marcus had learned from the briefing materials tended to read as cold to species who calibrated warmth through facial softness. He didn't read as cold to Marcus. He read as someone who had spent 18 years being very careful and was currently, for the first time in a while, uncertain about the geometry of a situation. Marcus Venn, Kareth said. His standard was precise and unaccented. Logistics coordinator, human delegation, observer status. Former observer status, Marcus said, sitting down. Apparently, something moved in Kareth's expression. Not quite amusement, not quite its opposite. Yes, the seat of receiving. He folded his hands on the table. I've been asking about you. I want you to know that because I think you're the kind of person who would find out anyway, and I'd rather tell you directly. What did you find out? Marcus said. That you have been on this station for 6 years, that your performance reviews are exceptional and entirely unremarkable. You do your job with high precision and no visible ambition, that your colleagues describe you as reliable and somewhat difficult to read, that you have no documented political affiliations, no recorded relationships with any of the Dominion's formal allies, and no prior contact with the Empress or her court before 4 days ago. Kareth paused. That everything that has happened this week appears to have begun with a cargo manifest error. It did, Marcus confirmed, which you fixed personally at 5 in the morning. The deadline was 6. There was no one else available. Kareth looked at him steadily. I have been trying to determine, he said, whether you are the most sophisticated political operator I have encountered in 18 years of council work, or exactly what you appear to be. Marcus considered this with the genuine attention it deserved. Those might not be mutually exclusive, he said, but I'm not operating politically. I don't have a political objective. I noticed a gap in your proposal's 3rd section because it looked like a routing discrepancy in a cargo manifest. I asked about it because asking about discrepancies is my professional reflex. The fact that it happened at a council table instead of a logistics terminal doesn't change what it was. Kareth was quiet for a moment. You understand that the documentation review will show the range was not an oversight. I assumed it wasn't, Marcus said, and you raised it anyway, knowing it would cost the proposal its clean passage, knowing it would create a visible confrontation at the primary table on your 2nd day of sitting there. I raised it because the gap existed, Marcus said, not because of what raising it would cost or produce. Those were secondary considerations. He paused. The gap would have moved things through your corridor, restructuring that the joint oversight process was specifically designed to catch. That's a logistics problem. I address logistics problems. Kareth studied him with the focused attention of someone who had built 18 years of expertise on identifying what people actually wanted, and was now experiencing the genuinely disorienting sensation of a person who appeared to want exactly what they said they wanted, and nothing else. It wasn't suspicion exactly. It was closer to the feeling of reaching for a step that isn't there. You have been placed at the primary council table by the Empress of the Vekarath Dominion, he said carefully. You have her court's resources, her minister's guidance, and her direct attention. You are going to be offered something formal before this conclave closes. A role, a position, some structure that makes your presence at that table permanent or recurring. Marcus had thought about this. He had thought about it the way he thought about all incoming data that required him to update his model of the situation, carefully, without resistance, following the logic wherever it went, regardless of whether the destination was comfortable. Probably, he said. And when that happens, Kareth said, you will become a political entity whether you intend to or not. The question of what you want will matter enormously to every party at that table, including mine. I understand that. So I'm asking you directly, Kareth said. What do you want, Marcus Venn? Marcus thought about it honestly. He thought about 6 years of manifests and the grinding comfort of predictable work, and the specific morning that had ended that chapter of his life as cleanly as a closed file. He thought about the reading chamber and the low table, and 2 seats at equal height, and the Empress asking questions that built on each other like the architecture of a system someone had been designing for a long time. He thought about the primary council table and the specific sensation of watching a room full of experienced people miss a discrepancy he had found in 30 seconds because he was looking at it as a routing problem rather than a political one. "I want the things that are moving to go where they're supposed to go," he said, "and I want the things creating gaps in the oversight systems to be identified and closed. That's what I've always wanted. The scale has changed. The objective hasn't." Kareth was quiet for a long moment, then, "That is either the most honest answer I have received at a negotiating table or the most sophisticated one." "I told you they might not be mutually exclusive," Marcus said. Something shifted in Kareth's expression. The full version of the fractional recalibration Marcus had seen in so many faces this week. The complete update rather than the partial one. He unfolded his hands. "The third section will be revised before the drafting stage," he said. "The threshold range will be reset to reflect the full operational distribution of carrier configurations across all 9 represented species." "That's a reasonable resolution," Marcus said. "I want something in return," Kareth said. "Not a concession, not a political favor." He paused, and what followed came with the particular deliberateness of someone who had decided something and was now committing to it. "I want your read on the Kelevar boundary dispute before the 7th session, the same way you read the transit proposal, as a logistics problem, not a political one, because I have been trying to find a resolution framework for 11 years, and I think you will find the routing discrepancy in 40 minutes. Marcus looked at him across the neutral table on level 6. Kareth looked back. 18 years of experience and a precise, careful intelligence that had spent 4 days recategorizing a situation it hadn't anticipated, arriving here, at this specific ask, in this specific register. Not supplication, not negotiation, something closer to professional recognition from someone who knew what competence looked like, and had decided that acknowledging it was more useful than resisting it. "Send me the documentation," Marcus said. "I'll look at it tonight." The Empress received him in the reading chamber that evening for the 4th time. Low table, 2 equal seats, warm light, the physical books in their genuine use order. Marcus was beginning to understand that the reading chamber was the room she occupied when she wasn't performing the role, just inhabiting it. Being invited into it was a category of access entirely separate from the formal mechanisms of court standing and council position. It meant something different. He wasn't sure he had a precise word for what it meant, but he had stopped needing precise words for everything. He gave her the Kareth meeting in full, not a summary, the full account, because she had asked him on the first evening to tell her what he observed, and he had learned she meant that literally. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 3 questions, each going deeper than the previous one, and he answered all 3 with the same precision he brought to everything. Then she set down her document and looked at him across the table with the directness she had used since the very first morning, since the conversation that had started with a grain manifest and arrived here through a chain of events Marcus could trace with complete logical clarity, and that still, when he traced it, produced a faint structural vertigo. The feeling of a calculation that kept returning a result he hadn't predicted. She spoke. The translator, who had learned over 4 evenings to render her precisely without embellishment, conveyed it cleanly. "I am going to propose a formal advisory role, permanent standing at the Conclave Council, quarterly access to Dominion trade flow data for independent analysis. The role has a title in the Vekarath system with no direct standard translation, but it carries the sense of a reader of movement, someone who tracks where things are actually going beneath the surface of where they appear to be going." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant offer." "It is a significant need," she said. 20 years of rule has given me advisors who are exceptional at reading political language. I have never had one who reads the underlying movement the way you do." "I'm a logistics coordinator," he said. "You keep saying that," she said, and something in the translator's rendering carried a quality that was dry and warm at the same time, which Marcus was fairly certain Vekarath court language wasn't formally supposed to contain. "I think you say it the way I sometimes say I am simply the Empress, not as a denial of everything that comes with it, as a reminder to yourself of the thing that was true before everything else became true alongside it." Marcus absorbed this. He thought about the manifest screen he still carried in his pocket every day out of habit, even on days with no manifests to check. He thought about how the skills he had built in 6 years of invisible work had translated with almost no friction into the most visible room on the station. He thought about the reading chamber and the equal seats, and the questions that built on each other, and the specific quality of being in a room with someone who wasn't asking him to perform competence, but simply to exercise it, and trusting that the results would speak for themselves. He thought about saying yes, and what yes actually meant. Not the logistics of it, the thing beneath the surface of where it appeared to be going. "I'll need my manifest screen," he said. "I work better with something to hold." The translator rendered this. The Empress looked at him. Then she said something short and precise, 4 words, and the translator rendered them with the care of someone who understood they were conveying something that mattered. She says that is already understood. Outside the reading chamber, the station continued without pause. Cargo moved through corridors. Codes were filed. The enormous grinding machinery of interstellar commerce ran its ordinary schedule. In the Grand Assembly Hall, 41 dignitaries from 9 species were preparing for tomorrow's sessions, adjusting positions, reading documentation, mapping the room. Somewhere in the lower decks, a small office sat empty, its terminal faintly smelling of burnt wiring, its schedule undisturbed and perfectly predictable. Marcus Venn sat in a warm room on level 7 across from the Empress of the Vakarath Dominion, and said yes. Not because he had been received into her court, not because he had sat in a chair he hadn't known the significance of, or because a grain manifest had been filed under the wrong code at 3 in the morning. He said yes because he had spent 6 years tracking the gap between where things were supposed to go and where they were actually going, and he had finally, without any remaining ambiguity, identified where he was actually going. The gap was closed. The route was correct. That was the job. That had always been the job. I started this story with a question. Who gave him permission? By now you know the answer. Nobody. Nobody gave Marcus Venn permission to sit in that chair, ask that question at the council table, close that oversight gap, or say yes to the most powerful person in the outer belt, across a table where both seats were exactly the same height. He just looked at the situation, found the discrepancy, and did what any good logistics coordinator would do. He fixed it. If you've been here from the first part, from the grain manifest and the wrong room at 5 in the morning, all the way to this moment, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. HFY Soundscape is where these stories live. The subscribe button is right there, and the next story is already waiting.